my favorite 90s movies is The Usual Suspects, and there's a great line in that movie. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And as we gather here on this homecoming weekend with our theme built around that classic The Wizard of Oz, I wonder if the wizard doesn't try to pull some version of the same trick. That is until Toto ruins it towards the end of the movie by running over and pulling the curtain back, and everything is unveiled. The wizard doesn't want people to know he's just a man who's putting on a show and pulling levers. The wizard gains his power from making people think that he has everything that they need, something that they don't have, and that he alone has the power to offer them their deepest desires. And he maintains his power through being mysterious and keeping people away at a distance. As we all know the movie so well, the irony in the story as it unfolds is that each of the supplicants who end up on that journey had what they needed inside them from the start. The scarecrow wasn't the smartest tool in the shed, or the sharpest tool in the shed, we might say, but he was smart enough to help guide his friends along the way. And while the Tin Man didn't have a mechanical heart, we see throughout their journey that he's able to offer compassion and care for his friends. And the Cowardly Lion simply has to learn that bravery doesn't mean you're not scared. Bravery is what you do in the face of being scared. And then Dorothy, of course, has to realize that she always had the power within herself to go home. She just didn't know it. But what about when we need something that isn't already inside us? Something that is beyond our ability to manifest, even if we have really good confidence and high self-efficacy. Like when our child is sick or possessed, as we hear about the woman in the first part of the gospel. Or when we face some kind of limitation or illness, as we hear in the man in the second part of today's gospel. Sometimes we need more. Something that's beyond our reach. And naturally, hopefully, we reach out to God for it. But God isn't like the wizard in Oz. God doesn't want to be distant and mysterious. God wants us to come close. So close that we understand God to be our home. The place where we find our grounding and all that we need. Now, I'm in that window of waiting for our college freshman to come home for the first time since she left for college to see if what I've heard so many times is true, that her car will be weighed down with every article of clothing she has that she hasn't washed herself so that we can help with the dirty laundry.
That's true.
Or to see if it's true, as I've heard, that she won't go back to school until she's raided the pantry and the closets and the cupboards for all the little things that she thinks are hers that she now claims and repatriates in Tennessee. And I'm quite sure there will be the requests for the favorite foods that she's been craving while she's been away, and that never gets old. Throughout our entire lives, there will always be things that only mom or dad or grandma makes best. But coming home is supposed to be about comfort and having the things you've been dreaming of, or at least I hope so. Even in homes that don't have a surplus of money or have sometimes struggled for food, coming home always lets you find, I hope, an abundance of love nonetheless. Because it's when the rest of the world is hard and life is a challenge that we find home is where we are always loved. Now, in today's gospel, that Syrophoenician woman doesn't go to her home. She goes to someone else's home where she hears Jesus is going to be. And Jesus has something she believes that she desperately needs. Despite his attempts to fly under the radar, she gets word of where he is. She knows where he is. She knows what he can do, and she makes her way there. And she travels to this particular home because life in her home is a mess. We don't hear a lot about it. All we hear about is her daughter, who we're told, has a demon possession. And this isn't like those of us who are raising kids and go through the terrible 2s and 3s, or again in the teenage years where we're like, oh my gosh, is this child possessed? This seems to be the real deal. And we can imagine that that might be just enough to have driven others away from her home. We don't hear about a husband. Maybe he couldn't take it. And the only one who can put up with a child with that many struggles is the mother who gave birth to her. And so she's left alone to travel to find this man from Nazareth and ask for his help. Now, every time we hear the story, we have to wrestle with Jesus' response to her demand, which is seemingly cruel. I've preached on that before. Children eat first. We don't throw food to the dogs. It doesn't sound like the Jesus we heard about last week, who is challenging these perceptions of people's worth based on things like the purity codes. And yet she persists in the face of that, and she throws back at him, yes, but even dogs get the crumbs from the children's table. And interestingly and oddly enough, Mark says it's because of what she says that Jesus gives her what she asks for. Jesus doesn't mention her faith like he typically does when somebody comes to him. He just takes note of her words and how she responds. And yet underneath her words, underneath all of her actions, faith is really what's on display nonetheless. Her faith in believing that Jesus could do anything, specifically what she needed him to do for her daughter. It was strong enough for her to make the journey alone to track him down. It was strong enough to speak to him alone when she was unworthy to do so on several levels. She was the wrong gender, she was the wrong religion, and she was from the wrong place. That faith was strong enough to challenge his first response when he seemed to want to dismiss her and get back to his respite. And then it was strong enough at the end of the story to believe him when he said, "Your daughter is well." When he could have been just telling her that to get her out of his hair and get back to what he was doing, she trusted in his word and went home, and her faith was, in fact, rewarded. Her home was peaceful again, and her daughter had returned to her. As she realized what she needed from Jesus, she did not approach him and say, "If I only was a man," or "If I only was a Jew," or "If I only came from Galilee." Her faith in approaching Jesus was based on what she knew of him and who she believed him to be. And also that she trusted in her own worth to come to him and ask for something at all. And the way in which she challenges Jesus' initial reaction is not just clever. It doesn't just show persistence. It is a deeply theological understanding of who it is she's talking to that allows her to push back. Although many get it wrong, and despite Jesus' attempts that people don't figure out who he is and what he's doing, she proves perhaps better than any that she understands this Son of God and what he's offering the world. And that is the knowledge of God's love, which is overflowing and abundant. So that when he throws out the argument about scraps from the table, she knows that that argument doesn't hold up, because he's already shown how big God is in God's generosity. God is so big that there is more than enough. So big that there are leftovers, aplenty, like there were at the end of the feeding of the 5,000. And if God, who Jesus works on behalf of, has so much to offer, then there is no need to worry about who comes first. His argument simply doesn't equate with the rest of the truth he tells. There is always more than enough. It's one of the lessons we know elsewhere in the Gospels too, like in the story of the prodigal father, when his son reaches rock bottom and is starving, but remembers that even if he goes to his father's house, the pigs have enough to eat there, and that will be all he needs. And there's a lesson in that going home story as well, that is the same lesson for all of us, that we can drag ourselves home under a load of dirty laundry and all sorts of things that are messy. That we can go home with a whole bunch of reasons why we shouldn't ask for more and ask instead. Because we have faith that what we have been craving is there and available to us. The best foods and the best things that can only be found at home. Now, Jesus may have wanted some alone time, as we heard at the start of this gospel. He may have gone into Gentile country thinking he could find it because he really had been ministering with Jews up to that point. And yet we also learn he doesn't really want to stay at arm's length when it comes right down to it. He gets intimate with people again and again through the Gospels and again in this one. He's still in Gentile country when you can't get much more intimate than what he does when they bring him this deaf man. And he takes him aside from the crowd one-on-one, and he puts his finger in his ears, and he spits on his fingers and touches the man's tongue. And he opens his ears, and he opens his mouth, and he opens a whole new life to that man. And maybe it's because something greater was opened in that exchange with the woman just shortly before this encounter with the deaf man. Because after talking to her, Jesus' ministry was opened wide. And for the rest of Mark's gospel, it's not just a ministry to Jews alone, but to Jews and Gentiles alike. Now, Jesus wasn't playing at being mysterious. He wasn't making it a holy game of hide and seek when someone needed something. And Jesus doesn't have prescriptions for us about long and arduous journeys to find what we come for. There is no formula that we need to follow. God is not some wizard behind a curtain somewhere in the shadows and using smoke and mirrors. There is no trick with God. If we'll have faith simply to believe that God is who God claims to be, and trust that we are worthy to ask for help ourselves, then we can skip ahead of all those doubts that start with, if I only had, you fill in the blank, then God would love me. God doesn't want us at arm's length or to keep us perpetually on some hamster wheel of proving ourselves. God is the home from which we are born and the home to which we return when we breathe our last and leave this world. And in between those 2 points, God wants us to realize God is also the home where love overflows and we find comfort, and where we find respite. Because all too often we forget that we can go home anytime we want to as well. No, there are no games and there are no tricks, but there are gifts. Gifts like grace and love, and forgiveness and mercy, healing and sustenance, purpose and identity. But the greatest gift God ever gave in sending Jesus was to convince the world that we shouldn't be afraid to come home.
Amen.